Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar session, Analyzing the New Truths in Supply Chain Management. My name is Garrett Colburn. I'm part of the Capgemini marketing team. I'll be moderating the webinar and facilitating our Q&A today. Before we introduce our speakers, I have a few comments about the webinar itself. Number one, it will be recorded. You'll get a copy of the recording and an email tomorrow. Two, all attendees are on mute, so you're unable to unmute yourself. And if you have questions or comments, there's a questions box in the control panel that you have. So if you submit those, I can see those. We'll have time for a moderated Q&A towards the end. So at any point, you can enter in your questions and we'll keep track of them and we'll save time at the end for that. All right, to start things off, I'm going to go through each of our speakers here and let them introduce themselves, say a few words. Danan, start with you.
Morning, everyone. My name is Dinan Tinolt, and I'm part of our North American Insights and Data Group, where I'm responsible for all our work in the consumer products, retail, and wholesale distribution field.
Great, thanks, Danan. Dan?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Simeon. I'm a Vice President with Insights and Data North America, and I'm responsible for artificial intelligence and data science practice here in North America.
Thanks, Dan. Alexander?
Hello, everyone. Alex Antoniadis here. I lead the data science practice here in San Francisco, as well as some key accounts through North America.
Okay, great. So we're going to dive right into the three different sections, a section for each speaker, and also we have a demo that Alex will be presenting halfway through. So Danan, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yep, absolutely. So let's move on immediately to the first slide. And let's, of course, place everything in perspective of what's happening today and what's going to happen post the current crisis. And what we've done is our Capgemini Research Institute has looked at the consumer interaction with online channels. What do consumers want these days, and how do you adapt to that from the context of your supply chain to make sure it's resilient but also adaptive, and it actually strengthens your business. So a couple of observations there. Of course, not surprising, is a lot of consumers are going to be much more cautious about cleanliness, health, and safety and such. But that'll probably, by the way, also mean a revival of, let's say, if you look at food and food traceability and such, to be able to show that you're fully in control of your food supply chain, and if necessary, you can see where certain products came from and such. Also, from an economic perspective, a lot of consumers are going to prefer local and regional products to show support with entrepreneurs in their area and such. And can you guarantee that? Yes or no? Some retailers are really highlighting this as one of their areas that they're quite active in, and that gives them a leg up as well. So, is your supply chain ready to leverage regional and local producers? Of course, consumers are also, very willing to switch to brands that show higher levels of product safety and such, whether it's from a food area, or let's say the cleanliness of certain products and such. There's increased focus on those. And of course, we know that with the current crisis, a lot more activity has been taking place online. So that's something we're going to have to take into account as well. If you look at the next slide, Garrett. So some of the key disruptive impacts that we have to consider. New paradigm for marketing and sales. What do we mean with that? There is more and more opportunity to engage directly with consumers and shoppers. Especially CP companies have been struggling with this during the crisis. How do they maintain their connection with their end consumers, and how do they keep driving that? And now that they've adapted to this somewhat, they'll continue in that way. There's an opportunity to drive the path to purchase. Also, consumer shopper insight is becoming increasingly important. We knew as well during the crisis some things were important, certain products, others less so. So that's given some insight we can leverage. There's also been shifts in the route to market, and of course the most visible one is the direct to consumer side. But there's also been other trends based on convenience, based on inspiration, and such. Certain consumers, they want a brand and what products that demonstrate value, that demonstrate sustainability and such. So that's also something you need to build into your supply chain to demonstrate to your consumers. Supply networks no longer fitting for purpose. We talked as well about how consumers, they want purpose, sustainability, value, safety, all those sorts of things. And that's one of the key things we'll talk about, is how consumer centricity is one of the things that is much more prominent these days, but hasn't been sufficiently articulated in the past. And that's something that's going to be much more important in the future. Also, there's going to be greater agility needed to adapt to consumer needs, to adapt to changing social circumstances, to adapt to crises. But it's not just adapting to crises, but it's also being agile in terms of if there's other changes going on with regard to certain brands or certain products that consumers want, adapting to that as well. And of course, we know these days cost pressure. We need to drive down the cost to improve the overall profitability of companies, and especially in the field of supply chain management, that's crucial. And that's also where you have a lot of value. So what we see a lot of our customers doing is right now is investing in supply chain analytics to drive the value from the supply chain using data. Lastly, of course, is keeping pace with technology for competitive advantage. So new platforms changing consumer habits, new technologies enabling entrance in business models, and there's also new data that we're getting. So whether it's the in-shopping, in-store experience, where we can actually monitor how much time consumers spend in front of shelves, whether they're bending over, whether they have to lean over to pick something up. So you can monitor that interaction better. We're pulling together data from multiple sources to understand consumer behavior, to understand their overall buying trends, to understand how that relates to when they want certain products, how they want it, where they want it, and such. So localization, predictability, also the changing trends and such, to be ahead of that so that your supply chain doesn't become disrupted, but that you can actually anticipate certain things. Don't go for an approach where everything you do is last week's demand and supply minus plus or minus some changes, or let's say this year's budget and this year's supply is basically last year's plus or minus some changes. No, make it real time. Really adapt to that specific situation. Adapt it to that specific store or that specific factory, so that you can actually tailor your demand to the specific locality. Going to the next one. Next slide, Garrett. So as we said, the traditional linear model is no longer useful. You know, basically going from raw products, production, warehouse, retailer, consumer, the old type of flow, still, let's say, may be relevant in some cases, but in others, we need to adapt much more and have the consumer at the center. So if we go to the next slide, what we'll talk about here is what can we do to really transform supply chains by setting up intelligent supply ecosystems with the consumer at the center. So we're looking at the retail channels, looking at distribution partners, production systems, the supplier base, society, and innovation partners and such. Those are all players in this field, all of which have their own influence, have their own data, and can contribute to how do we serve this end consumer, how are we adaptive in that field. And what data do we have as well that we could possibly share across the supply chain? The whole concept of data sharing is something which is going to be more and more upcoming in the future as well. So yes, you have your own data, you buy some third-party data, but there's other sources as well. So that's another key trend going on there. Moving to the next slide. Interesting as well, recently the Gartner 2020 Supply Chain Top 25 and Masters was published, and this is available online where you can look at some of these results, and you see the logos of the companies there. Apart from specific factors where all of them are better at than others and such, well, one of the three key observations in this were that the supply chain masters often are purpose-driven. business model transformers, and digital orchestrators. So what does this mean, purpose-driven? That means they really have an underlying mission that they want to achieve, whether it's on safety or customizability or let's say optimal service. Whatever their purpose is, they embed that in everything they do. It becomes almost a cornerstone habit of each of these organizations. They're also willing to transform their business models in light with changing consumer demands, in light with changing social circumstances and such. So they actively adapt to those situations as well. Finally, also digital orchestrators. They invest a lot in the digital infrastructure, in the data, in democratizing that data, in enabling all parts of the organizations to leverage, to get the value from that, and to be able to leverage that. And then investing a lot in proofs of concepts, in analytics and such to drive that value through a data-driven supply chain. Moving to the next slide. So addressing some of the challenges and trying to improve your supply chain really requires transformation across the supply chain by building a range of new capabilities. So, being more focused on consumer innovation, having connected autonomous planning, end-to-end control towers. So you're trying to improve supplier collaboration, understanding what prices are going to be optimal, getting insights into the market and the competitive visibility, collaborating with suppliers as well, connecting all of your manufacturing capabilities, connecting the distribution parts, and also collaborating with your customers as well, sharing the insights and such. So again, this goes back to the earlier point of having that ecosystem. Don't seeing yourself in isolation as a factory with a simple standard approach, but build in that loop of feedback, that data exchange, and that constant innovation of new use cases, how you can leverage data for your supply chain. Going to the next one. So a data-powered supply chain will make it easier to unlock the value of collaboration and drive out costs. And if we look at how do we make it tangible, here are some specific examples of how we've done that for quite a few clients. So there's areas such as demand and supply planning, neural forecasting, forecasting analytics, inventory optimization, customer and supplier collaboration. There are real tangible benefits that we've helped realize for clients, and depending on the level of maturity or level of progress, those savings have been quite significant. So for example, improving forecasting accuracy between 10 and 30%. Realizing anywhere between 15 and 30% inventory reduction. This has a significant financial impact, which can be of great value for companies, which really drive the bottom line. On the sourcing side, spend analysis, commodity analytics, supplier collaboration, predictive analytics. We've done these things for many years. Now, strategic sourcing and spend analysis is not something new, but the level of analytics involved now, the level of natural language processing that's used as well to make the connection between certain aspects is much more significant and much more automated than in the past. And that really helps drive down material costs, excess inventory, labor costs, and such. Then looking at the overall production process itself as well, capacity planning and scheduling, manufacturing 4.0, manufacturing footprint. You see all of the components there that help realize the value. So equipment productivity going up, work in progress and inventory going down. You'll see percentages between 15 and 20%. Rework and waste going down. On-time delivery, absolutely improving those figures. So it helps with the production process, and finally, of course, with delivering. We've seen in the COVID crisis, especially at the beginning, all these shelves empty. Everyone going for certain products and less for others. It does show sort of what we consider the most important and what the popularity of certain products are. But using data also helps with out-of-shelf analysis to see how can we prevent it. And that is not a macro level thing, but that can very much depend on what specific geographies, what specific stores in specific areas. And it's not just in crisis times, it's overall in any situation. For example, you might have certain stores which deliver specific products consistently across all of their stores. But if it happens to be right next door to a sports stadium and such, you would expect them to adapt more, let's say, to that sports club, to the specific fashion requirements there. But this local adaptation doesn't always take place. And being able to localize in a way that it takes into consideration the demographics of a certain area makes it much easier to be impactful in your overall neighborhood and leveraging your supply chain to fulfill specific customer needs. So those are some of the aspects with regard to delivery. If we go to the next slide, key aspect as well is how do you, shall I say, how do you enable this? How do you enable this through data? So you might be able to say, well, we're going to take specific initiatives in each of these fields and such, and we're going to launch projects on that, and use the information data we have on raw materials, supplier, manufacturing, distributing, and such. But it's not possible to just do a one-off project in one specific field. You really have to look at the chain of events and the chain of data to be able to maximize the benefit you can get from that, and also to open up the data across the supply chain and sometimes even across the brands within your organization. So important things there are to open up that data, to democratize it. When you're looking at specific use cases, to look at that from a holistic perspective across the supply chain, across all the different process steps and all of the actors within your supply chain. And then going to the next slide, it's also important to sustain these things as well over time through a, let's say, business case approach, which helps you create a self-funding mechanism. Oftentimes, an initiative is launched in terms of leveraging analytics for whether it's supply chain or a customer experience or something, and that's a one-off project. You get the results, and then it's back to business. But it's important to create that flywheel where you can continue from it. So when you take that value that you've realized, you put it back into future analytics projects, so that you can actually use that to open up more data and to democratize that and create further use cases. Because simply put, oftentimes we spend 70% of the money on data management and only 30% of the money on the value creation through analytics. But actually, it's the analytics part where the value creation takes place, where the actual money is. So you would say, let's turn that percentage around. Let's free up more money for business use cases and make our overall data management much more efficient, democratize the data, and to see how we can enable future value creation. So that gives a high-level overview of some of the aspects. We talked about various use cases of supply chain analytics, how that's done. A key area is what we call demand sensing, which feeds into the overall assortment optimization, predictive analytics, and such. And that's an area where Alex will talk about a bit further right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Danan. Alex, I just gave you control if you want to go ahead.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Dinan. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about demand sensing and a little bit about what is demand sensing, how is it different to demand forecasting, and what are the enhancements and the business value that is pretty much underlying there, and how you can better utilize those insights. So first of all, demand sensing is more relevant than ever, especially now with the whole COVID situation, right? Where not only most of the data are obsolete, but generally also the customer has completely changed the way they're interacting with the different products and how they're buying. And specifically here, we're going to use COVID as a good example to practically showcase how demand sensing differs from demand forecasting and all the other enhancements that you would get from that. So first of all, as we talked about, the difference is that we're using not only advanced models, but we're using also we use data augmentation in the center. So we can be more, move from just reactive on past forecasting recommendations to being reactive and see what's going to happen in the near term versus in the long term. So pre-COVID data have limited value, we cannot really use that. Even if we use that, our models are gonna showcase something something at a very high level aggregation that's not gonna be very useful, especially during this period. Because of COVID, we're also having different customer buying frequencies, and this is even more important now. To instead of aggregating demand on a weekly basis, it's more important to not only have on a daily basis, but even on an intraday, and understand what are the patterns. When do I have to fill stock much sooner so we don't have any empty shelves? Customer basket size and composition have changed. How the frequency that they're buying, what's in the basket, what products, and that's what we're talking about. The next bullet, which is product bundles, all that has changed, and that has to be also considered. And at the end, also the store by itself has changed, right? How customers are actually buying through stores, how customers are doing some research before going to the store to shop, how they're potentially just going there for a pickup versus actually to browse through the products. All those aspects from the online perspective and the brick and mortar perspective change the way the people interact, and of course are going to change the demand. So our solution goes beyond just better models. Everybody hears that we can use neural networks and all that. That's already being deployed, but that doesn't add that much value at some point and after. There's a clear point of diminishing returns on that from an accuracy perspective. The real power is on incorporating all that data that's out there. Right? Most companies we see utilize some historical data and some very basic demographic data that are available online. What we're bringing here, and we're going to go through some examples through the demo, is that data augmentation enables you not to also have a better accuracy, but also have a better accuracy for near-term demand, and also be able to maybe be more reactive, be more proactive than reactive on these cases. And we're going to explain it right now. And we're going to go into the solution as well a little bit later, but right now we're looking at incorporating automatically all these restrictions due to COVID, understanding how an area has been affected, not only from COVID cases, but also all the restrictions that come with that. Incorporation of proximate store inventories, how your store and your company store, as well as all the competitors, indirect and direct, are maybe changing the gameplay, and how would that affect demand at the store level specifically. Understanding your customer and where he has been. We have data that we can pull and understand what's exactly the customer's location, not right now, but what has been so far the customer interaction, what he's been doing. So you can be very precise and understand what every customer is doing. So instead of trying to infer that behavior of the customer, you can directly go and see the data and have much more accurate results. And yeah, exactly, not infer data from what has happened in the past. Also online data. Usually online data is not captured correctly, both from in-house online data, also from third-party online data. So how people are interacting with the product before they even buy it, before they even convert, that also has a lot of information that can be utilized on how that's going to affect demand. Customer behavior and product modeling has also changed a lot. And that's where it becomes a little bit more reactive on our side. So understanding how your customer has changed, how they're interacting with the products, how do they buy, what's the basket size at the end of the day, can also help you not only try to sense the demand, but also potentially try to manipulate demand so it fits your inventory levels. And last slide here, this is where we try to capture everything together, right? At the end of the day, what we're gonna have is understand fully what's happening with your customer. We're not looking only at a product-centric demand. It's a combination of inventory, your customer behavior, and of course the demand, but also on a very granular level. So we're gonna use some base forecast, of course, the aggregated level of demand is for most products is not going to change. But what we need to better understand is, as we discussed above, get that geo-specific data, get the customer location history and how they're exactly interacting with the different stores, how getting competitor data and understanding how that's going to affect your demand, and also understand what insights you can gather from online traffic, among other many data sources, enable us to use in our enhanced models to understand what's your customer, what products they're going to buy, when, why, what products are going to go with that, what's the potential cross-sell, upsell that might affect the demand. And at the end of the day, all that gets fed into a pretty vast array of models, assembled models that provide us a result. And I want to go and just showcase a demo, so it's a little bit more visual. So we're going to use our 890 platform, which is our platform of application an inventory of applications and data that we have available. So what we're going to see here, the yellow line is what you would get from your very basic forecasting. We see a lot of clients just not use the most advanced data science techniques. The blue line is where you have more advanced data techniques in the data science space, but not maybe the data augmentation that's required. And here, the green line is where you actually introduce that data, that additional data. And this is an example for a specific facility model. This is a model working real time, so apologies for any delay. But you see here, we set COVID impact to 50%, COVID restriction to 50%. Again, this is just to visualize these things happen in the back end. That value is going to be automatically populated. And so what you can see is that even with a really good model, but without the correct data, you would completely miss the demand. You would miss that the demand would have a slighter peak during pretty much May, and then how everything would go further down after that because of different restrictions. So you would expect demand would be up, but because of restrictions, you see the demand going down. And just quickly going through another example, just to get a better understanding. Let's look at, I think that's. It's another example to see how everything's going to be affected. Again, we can select more values, more features, but just an example here. This is a live running demo. This is actual data on the back end. But yeah, what we're trying to showcase here is that a lot of data might change. So here you might think that just with the COVID impact, you see that you're expecting a higher demand actually than what you're getting if you did not include that. And if we just also add the COVID restriction, we should be able to see that although we were expecting more sales due to COVID impact, we're going to see that just because of the restrictions, the demand is going to be lower than what was expected. Let's wait it to run. Again, real data running. So given the restriction, we see that actually we're expecting a lower demand than expected at the beginning. And because we're expecting some restrictions to be lifted further up, the demand is still going to be higher at the later half of the prediction. That's all from me. Then we can have Dan provide a little bit more information around the supply chain analytics piece of this.
All right, great. I've got the slides back up for you, Dan, if you wanna do our last section.
Sure. Thank you so much, Garrett and Alex. So as you already saw on the presentation that Alex and the demos that we presented, we talked about demand sensing. However, demand sensing is just one of the supply chain analytics that needs to be deployed. Whenever we are looking, from a supply chain analytics maturity framework that we are showing right now, we are having like three main directions. The first one is around the data exploration. So we need to make sure that the data that it is coming in, it is the right data. It's the data is coming at the right pace. It could be in batches, could be near real time, or could be real time. Depends on the application, depends on the use case that we need to solve for it. Second stage, in terms of supply chain analytics, is around predictive analytics. And that is answering the question, what will happen and why? So if like the first piece is just looking backwards, now we are just looking forward, and we are trying to understand and run simulations based on the models that they are built on the data that was done in the first step of as data exploration. For instance, just craft predictive models using data mining, forecasting, demand sensing, and any other statistical analysis. Now, moving further on the analytical maturity, that's the third piece, which is the decision optimization. So now we address the question, what will happen? What can we do about it? So that's where we are running optimizations based on different objective functions that we might want to eventually minimize the time lead, maximizing the revenue, and any other type of decisions that needs to be made in supply chain. If we're going to go to the next slide, Darren, would be great. So, as I said, here are a couple of examples of supply chain analytics. The demand sensing, demand forecasting, we already talked about. But here, what I would like to point it out is the fact that now we are moving more or less away from traditional time series regression models like ARIMA type to models that they are much more tactical in nature, much more granular, that is giving us information and insights on how to act at the much more granular level. And that's for that reason, we need the advanced analytics. We need the machine learning type of models in order to be able to run so many models, giving the granularity that it is required. Next type of supply chain analytics in inventory management. So that's where we have the supervised machine learning algorithms to eventually predict the raw materials, the semi-finished goods, what will be the inventory turnover, and any shelf lives to meet any anticipated demand. So the demand forecasting, it's kind of input for the inventory management whenever we develop this type of models. Now, nothing is going to happen without the logistics. And that's where we are thinking about the logistic optimization, not only logistics analytics. So that's where we have the machine learning algorithms to model and to optimize the supply stock and supplier volatility. We talked about demand generation, demand scenario generation a little bit more, but that's where we identify the full spectrum of demand scenarios and what will be the inventory rebalancing, especially given the situations which we are right now, and where we have huge changes in demand. And at the very end, we talk about the Procure Smart. That's where it's a procurement recommendation engine eventually needs to be built to forecast next best restocking plans. So a couple of examples on this slide in terms of supply chain analytics and the fundamentals of the supply chain analytics that we are thinking about. Now, if we're going to move to the next slide, you're going to see the framework in terms of what are all the components whenever we talked about the entire ecosystem of supply chain solutions. We talked about a couple of them, but here it is from an example about how all these pieces are interacting together and how they are bringing together. Whenever we are thinking about operational analytics, we are thinking about anything from the plants. If, let's say, we are talking about a manufacturer, what is the plant optimization under risk scenarios? We talk about suppliers and obviously, if we are talking about suppliers, we are talking about inventory management, given the fact that we have the disruption and the competition. The third parties, we talked about demand forecasting, but also the consumer face and the distributors. Think about, on the consumers, that's around the marketing analytics, how I'm gonna get my consumers, so that will gonna impact my demand. At the same time, we are talking about the distributors and what are the best incentives, hence the incentive analytics, in order to have and get you the visibility on the end-to-end supply chain. But actually, this is not all if you are thinking about the operational analytics. If you're going to move to the next slide, what you're going to see is that in order to operate, because we talked about operations right now until now, we need to have the development, which is to the left-hand side, and we need to talk about the service, which is on the right-hand side. So this is the end, our ecosystem end-to-end for engineering and manufacturing analytics, where it's including anything from the development, from R&D, design, the supply chain, to operate, which means to install and operate and control, to service. So maintain whatever we build and modernize and replace if that's the need. And that needs to be done across all the functional areas, but at the same time across all the sectors, and it's applicable to all the sectors. If we're going to go to the next slide, we're going to infuse, and we're going to see how to infuse the artificial intelligence in the all the components of the supply chain. And why do we need to do that? So if we're talking about suppliers, as Dinan mentioned, once we're going to build the AI models, we'll be able to reduce the supplier risk. We're going to increase the visibility to the first, second tier suppliers, eventually third tier suppliers. On the warehouse, we need the inventory optimization, the network optimization. On the sales channels, we need the demand forecasting, we need the pricing optimization. On the customer, we need anything from sentiment to recommendation engine. But the idea is that all of these components need to work in sync in order to provide an end-to-end automated optimization. Otherwise, if we are looking in isolation, we're going to give us not necessarily the best insights that we could generate. Now, on the next slide, we're going to see an example of how we applied AI and ML on augment optimization on an end-to-end solution. So this is an example where we look at the logistic analytics. So we look at the container location, we look at the shipment plans, we look at historical data, and we build the machine learning models using the Markov chaining and deep neural networks in order to build the demand scenarios and the optimization to make sure that we have the right components and at the right place, but at the same time, making sure that we have the right containers around the world in the right place. So again, an example where you integrate everything from the warehouses, or from the demand, starting with demand planning to our warehouses, to logistic optimizations in order to be able to optimize and gain the insights on better allocation of the containers in order to achieve the parts and having the parts in the right time and the right in the right location. I think that's all our presentation for today. I'm going to turn back to Garrett for questions.
All right, thank you, Dan. A reminder, everybody, there's a questions box in the control panel. You can submit a question. I have a couple that have come through that I'll start with as we wait for some others. The first one is, in supply chain analytics, what areas have you seen an uptick in since COVID? For example, technology, interest, or types of strategic projects? Dan or Alex, anything, any initial thoughts?
Sure. So, yes, we saw a huge impact and a huge stress, I could say, on the supply chain, given the COVID-19 situation. I could say that was much more demand in terms of operations rather than strategic projects, and trying to rebalance and re-optimize the supply chain. At the same time, one of the big inputs that we are using in supply chain is the demand, and that's what Alex presented to you in terms of demand sensing. Moving from the traditional forecasting to the demand sensing, that was something very, very important. And when we talked about that, we saw a lot of requests coming in to make sure that not only that the models needs to be retrained, not only that maybe the models needs to be rebuilt, so the techniques maybe needs to be adapted, but also the data needs to be enhanced, and maybe the pace of the data that it is coming in and the granularity that the data it's needed needs to be changed in order to answer to the challenges in a COVID-19 situation.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And just to add to that, right? I mean, we're seeing a lot of changes to the supply chain as well, right? So it's not only that the demand has fluctuated, but also how the different sub-products might change, and you have to adjust your whole supply chain to accommodate for that, right? The very obvious example with restaurants, where those bulk items that just were much easier on your supply chain just do not exist anymore. So you still want to just 100% cater for the customer when we're talking about mostly food products, right? That, although overall the demand might not have gone down, but the sub-product and how the supply chain has established completely goes to garbage, right? You gotta completely go into the drawing board and see how you can re-optimize your supply chain for the current situation. Yep.
Okay. Are we seeing any change in the way the client's teams are working in the work from home environment? And maybe I think this, I'm interpreting this as just maybe where they're reporting into, or the in a level of prioritization in the company, things like that, as well as maybe just the work from home element.
So definitely, we saw an impact from, especially on the manufacturing side, given the work from home, that we have policies in place across the globe. Now, obviously, whenever we are talking about manufacturing, yes, work from home can be done as much as can be done, but at the same time, we saw that given the situation with COVID-19 and the restrictions, the supply chain is starting to have a lot of pressure. And that's, we saw companies across the globe trying to solve for the problems on how to get back to work, actually, in a safe environment. And for that, they are starting to deploy different solutions in order to maintain the levels that they are required for the supply chain and not impacting the production.
Okay. Another question. The opportunities presented by COVID demand speed, but most of what was shown requires robust interfaces, clean data, clear, consistent metrics, definition, etc. The question is, how does one leverage the model you presented in the highly time-sensitive environment presented by COVID?
I can take that. So I'm assuming the question is, how do you capture the, how do you produce results really fast in order to pretty much don't miss the COVID wave? Would that be?
Yeah, I think it's also how do you, if your business, it probably presumably takes time to be in a state where you can have the clean data. So if you're trying to respond quickly now, maybe you're not as sure in all those other areas. How do you still do that in a quick situation like COVID?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's the beauty, right? We're using data that have been already cleansed. They're already in an environment that we can just really quickly just select the features and the data that we need to use and are applicable for our specific clients. And then just we have the models ready, they're tested already. And we just need to customize a little bit for the specific capabilities and needs of the client. And they're ready to deploy. So not really major data cleansing, which is indeed something that a lot of more custom solutions might have. I'm not saying this is not a custom solution, but all the data wrangling is usually has been already taken care of, right? These are third-party data providers that we've been interacting for a while, and we know exactly what to expect, and everything is we have the reusable assets to deploy really fast. The second piece of that is just again understanding what are the specific needs for the customer. We know exactly what to expect. There are small differences between industries, right? So, for example, in retail, you might need to better understand what's happening in competitors or what's happening in your other stores. There are other industries, maybe more in pharma, where that information is not that applicable. But there's always other data sources that can be utilized that are ready to be utilized immediately. So we're looking at a really quick deployment here overall.
Okay, I don't see any other questions coming through, so I will just close out here. We've got, if there's any specific questions, you can reach out via social media or reply to me. I'm the one who's got the invites and registration emails that you got when you registered. You can send me a note as well, or ruben.a.garcia@capgemini.com is handling any inbound questions and requests that people have. Thank you to all of our presenters today. I appreciate all the time, and you'll get the recording sent out tomorrow. Appreciate everybody joining, and have a good rest of the week.